Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Through Conversations podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dalton Conley. Dalton Conley is the Henry Putnam University professor in sociology and a faculty affiliate at the Office of Population Research and the Center for Health and Well-Being. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and in a pro bono capacity, he serves as Dean of Health Sciences for the University of the People, a tuition-free, accredited, online college committed to expanding access to higher education. Conley's scholarship has primarily dealt with the intergenerational transmission of socioeconomic and health status from parents to children. He earned an M.P.A. in public policy and a Ph.D. in sociology from Columbia University, and a Ph.D. in biology from NYU. In this conversation, we discuss his book, The Genome Factor, what the Social Genomics Revolution reveals about ourselves, our history, and the future. We dive deep into the nature versus nurture debate. We discuss genetics and the role they play in the way we develop as human beings. Genetic diversity, the gay gene, sperm banks, and the use of genetic information, assortative mating, Tinder, 23andMe, and more. With you, Dalton Conley. So, Professor Conley, I'm here with you in these crazy times, I must say, these unprecedented times for everyone. And I cannot stress how grateful I am with you for taking the time to have this important conversation, which delves on many issues that we're seeing and many issues that we're not seeing and that we've seen in the past. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the field of sociology right now? What is the future telling you about this field?
Wow, that's a big question, Alex. Sociology, to be quite honest, I had been sort of pessimistic about the future of sociology in recent years, feeling like a lot of the knowledge that we had to impart to the world and share with the world, and the kind of lens for looking at the world had already been adopted by college students before they even take a sociology class. So, for example, 20 years ago when I first started teaching Introduction to Sociology, I guess, more than 20 years now, the idea that gender was a social construction or race was a social construction was a concept that really, I don't want to say blew people's minds, but like definitely challenged their young people's assumptions and so forth. That's sort of, at least among people who go to university these days in the US, that's generally a kind of understood, accepted idea. The idea that there's gender doesn't have to be, or even sex doesn't have to be a binary category. That's part of the law now. I mean, these were things that were new ideas, or at least not widely accepted, 2 or 3 decades ago. Same thing with one of the things I've worked on, the racial wealth disparity. Nobody knew about it in the mid-90s when I was working on it, and now it's kind of in every discussion about racial inequality in the United States. So that's good, but you can put yourself out of business by we didn't solve those problems, but at least bringing them to the forefront in the U.S. So I didn't, yes, there's certain subfields in sociology that I thought have still a lot to do and a lot of interesting work to be done in. But recent events have both the pandemic and the George Floyd incident and the response in terms of mass protests have, I think, brought sociology back to incredible, not that those things weren't relevant before, but has sort of heightened the awareness for the need for kind of sociological analysis. And maybe we'll see that in, like, for example, undergraduate enrollments, which were huge in the 1960s in a very similar time to now, then declined over the next 40 years or so, and maybe they'll rise again now that it seems like a new era of thinking and public sentiment.
And it brings me to your book, The Genome Factor. what the social genomics revolution reveals about ourselves, our history, and the future, which we will try to cover the three: ourselves, the history, and the future. And I remember a quote when you said that there are certain topics, and especially now, that come into the moral landscape of discussing, right? So there was this philosopher that you quoted that said there are certain things that even though we can study, we shouldn't. And that's a conversation we will have to have as policymakers and the public. So tell us how the genome factor comes into play when we start talking about this debate that you talk about nurture and nature, and you argue that this is over. There is no longer a debate. It's an interplay. So take me deep into this idea about the relationship between them.
Well, this field of social genomics, as we call it, which is brand new or relatively new, emerged over the last decade or so, that integrates genetics and social science. That field has been made possible by a variety of forces. One, of course, is technology, that we now have the ability to take, basically a tablespoon of your saliva or even less and measure your genome pretty well. So we can now look for the genes that affect human behavior and social outcomes that sociologists and other social scientists, economists, political scientists have typically been interested in and have only studied the environmental or nurture side of the equation thus far. So that's one driving force in the emergence of this field is just simply there's the technology there. Just like if you didn't have a telescope or we didn't have LIGO to detect gravitational waves, we couldn't study it. But now we have the methods and the technology to study it. But there's also broader intellectual currents that have led to this moment. And I can talk about me personally, and then I can talk about in my analysis of the field. For me personally, I certainly trained as a sociologist and social scientist at first. I definitely fell on the nurture side of the equation. I thought that biology had not no role, but a relatively minor role when compared to social environment in terms of determining who we become, not in terms of like maybe personality or some other sort of more basic psychological characteristics, but in terms of socioeconomic status, how far we get in school, education, income, wealth, that kind of thing. But as I delve into the literature more and more, I found that the prior epoch of genetics research in this field called behavioral genetics relied on twin studies, adoptees, and I looked at that literature, and in general, the impact of genes was estimated there to be between, depending on the outcome, 20% and 70%. So, roughly, actually, someone did a meta-analysis, a literature review of 50 years of these kind of studies, and found that the mean or median heritability or proportion that is genetic in the variation in the population for all these outcomes, including medical outcomes, psychological outcomes, social outcomes, was 49%. So it's literally almost 50% genetics, 50% nurture. I started, again, from my sociological perspective, wanting to shoot down those studies and delving into the assumptions, for example, of twin studies, and showing that there was a confounding between the fact that identical twins, which are compared to fraternal twins, same-sex fraternal twins, in order to estimate how much influence is genetic and how much is environment. The assumption is basically that identical twins are on average, twice as genetically similar than fraternal twins. And then it's kind of questionable how much more similar their environments are. And that's called the equal environments assumption. And that's the core assumption that I wanted to try to dismantle. And now that we have these technologies of genotyping, we're able to tell, not just on parental report on the twins' reports themselves, but through DNA analysis, whether a set of twins is actually fraternal or actually identical. And in a certain minority of cases, the self-perception of the twins or the perception of them within their family is actually wrong. And it's more often that the case that identical twins are thought to be fraternal because there are because of nurture, because of environmental differences, that even minor ones in utero before birth. Twins can be born, for example, with vastly different birth weights, where one gets the front seat with respect to the placenta and the other gets the back seat and sort of gets the scraps left over. So one's larger, one's smaller. And when they come out that way, people think, oh, well, they can't be identical. Look how different they are. And then they're sort of stereotyped or typed that way, and they think they're fraternal. And turns out they were actually genetically identical. It's just the in utero environment that caused some differences in how they appeared through their childhood. So anyway, the point is that by using these misclassified twins, who kind of grow up in one environment of thinking they're fraternal, or vice versa. Fraternal twins can just by chance look very alike, so they're treated as identical. And we see that kind of breaks apart the equal environment assumption and stands it on its head. And we can reanalyze the twin data and see if we get the same heritability results. And much to my surprise, with some exceptions in terms of popularity and social network measures, for the most part, the estimates of the heritability of things like body mass index, height, but also social behaviors like or social outcomes like depression, a grade point average, and so forth, came out to be the same. So I had to acknowledge that nurture played a bigger role than I thought it was. And so luckily, I came to this realization at a time, as I mentioned before, that there's incredible technological advancements going on, and the ability to actually measure the genome. So instead of just inferring the effective genes and what percentage it is based on twin or adoption studies, for example, we can actually now go in and measure the genome and really understand what's going on in terms of what we call the genetic architecture. So that's my personal journey, and I can keep going on that because I feel like genetics actually provide a tool to social scientists, not just a competing narrative. And I'll come back to that, but I think there's also a broader sort of societal story of why this field is emerging now, besides the technology, besides the sort of internal logic of scientific papers that, question previous assumptions and so forth. I just finished Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which was written in 1945 in 9 days after he was liberated from a concentration camp. And in it, he describes the different reactions of people in a concentration camp in World War II. And he basically chalks it up to a choice. Like, yes, these are extreme, dire circumstances that people face, but how they react, whether they become more of a collaborator or a resistor, or they give up hope and just die in their bed, in their cot. He says it's just the choice, what kind of attitude they have. He was vastly criticized for that. From my perspective, what was interesting about that was that there was no mention of that our kind of cognitive repertoire, cognitive choices are limited by either social structure, that is the environment in which we have been raised to that point, or by biology or genes. It was really, we had this kind of dire circumstance, and then individual reactions to that circumstance, to that social shock, if you will, were just, there's no explanation of where they come from, those differences. And I was thinking about it, and so basically from the point that after the Nazis through, I would say, at least the 80s, if not 2000s, the kind of understanding of human nature was that it was almost the pendulum had gone very much to the environment.
Mm-hmm.
After the Nazi horrors, the thought that there was actually fundamental differences, especially between groups of people that were biological, was very unacceptable.
Yeah.
And it reached its peak in the 70s when gender reassignment surgery was done, and it was thought that there was no fundamental biological influence on gender identity, and we could just reassign kids that were born with ambiguous genitalia or where there was an accident and a baby was castrated, a male baby, and they could turn them into a female baby and there was no problem, just raise them that way. I mean, that's the extreme version, and that was shown not to be the case. So the pendulum started slowly going back to the idea that something biological has a role to play as well. So I think that it's understandable to see that when you have totalitarian regimes in the 20th century and you see how people react so differently and how radically society can shift and the social environment can shift, in a matter of years, it makes sense to think that the environment matters a lot more than individual biological difference, even though, of course, everyone has different response to those changes. That wasn't as important or in the public consciousness as the fact that the social environment could radically shift. And a lot of the research in the 60s, for example, showed the power of social environment. The Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram experiment, Zimbardo's experiments, and social breaching, all of those showed that you put a person in a certain social situation and in a certain role, their behavior will radically change. And basically trying to explain Nazism, I think, is the sort of subtext to all that. Mm-hmm. So the real focus was on social environment, to try to understand these kind of major historical events and how people behaved in them. But then again, now, at least until COVID and until the sort of social unrest, at least since the late 60s, and we've been in a period in the US at least of relative stability and complacency. So I think that that's allowed the notion that most of what we can explain is due to not major historical or institutional shifts in the environment, but due to genetic differences. Not most, but at least some of it, we can now, in a stable environment, sort of try to understand individual difference through genetics. Though, of course, just because the environment is stable doesn't mean it's not having a major impact on who we become. So I think history is part of the story of why the pendulum keeps shifting back and forth between nature and nurture. But I do agree, from a scientific point of view, the debate is over. Obviously, both matter. How they matter depends on what historical period, what society you're in, and so forth. But I don't think we can deny, any scientist could deny, that genetics influence social outcomes as well as the environment.
Wow.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's just great, because everything you say just reminds me of how my personal point of view was that, as you mentioned a lot of times right now, is that once we think that everything is caused by the environment, we have a lot of more power to change things. That's the basic assumption. That's like when someone gives you this news, for example, it sheds a light of hope in changing our institutions and our economic models. And on the other hand, what's counterintuitive is that understanding our biological underlying pinnings can make a drastic change as well, because it comes to even a philosophical model based on genes, right? So if we all share the same genes, for example, given that you're in an unequal country, those genes don't appear to seem to have a significant difference in the way you develop. For example, if a white person, let's say, has the same gene as an African American, but the African American lives in a poor area, the genes that influence the IQ development reduced by a lot, and taking some it into racism, some it into these things that you discuss in the Genome Factor, it makes you wonder that will it be possible to live in a quote unquote utopia where we create such an environment that everyone has the equal opportunity to flourish as human individuals, because it seems that the underlying narrative of genes says that we can, right? But the environment stresses out that it can vary a lot.
I mean, what you're talking about is what we call a gene environment interaction, or G by E. And the most classic way to talk about it is, imagine there's a genotype for aggression. If you're born into a poor urban neighborhood, that might lead you to very bad outcomes, into crime or violence or so forth. But if you're born into a rich, privileged condition, that might lead you to be like an aggressive venture capitalist.
CEO, for example.
Yeah. So I think that kind of idea that genotype is a prism that refracts the white light of the environment into a rainbow of different responses, i.e. that you can't really think about genes in an environment independently of each other, but we want to study systematically how they interact and interplay with each other. That's what motivated a lot of the social scientists who, when it, decided to get involved in measuring genetics and in invoking it in their models. That promise of having a complete picture that includes biology and environment, but that shows how they're kind of interrelated. There's, just a couple of additional thoughts on that topic. One is, I think people incorrectly assume that genetics equals some sort of like predestination and like it's not in your control. Like, well, if you have a certain genotype that makes you do X, Y, or Z, you don't have free will. Mm-hmm. But if it's your early childhood environment that matters before you're really even fully conscious as a human being, that matters. That's just as much out of your control, and quote unquote reduces your free will. If we want to take those kind of explanations seriously. So I don't think the question of like free will and choice, and this is not just a philosophical discussion because it matters, and people use these kind of arguments in courts of law and so forth. But the genes or environment, they're equally kind of irrelevant in my view to whether or not we have free will and conscious choice or not. We tend to think, again, incorrectly, that just because something's genetic, we can't do much about it. If people with a certain genome type get less schooling than other people, or are more likely to have mental illness than other people with another genetic profile, well, that's just in the genes. Let's not spend any money on schools. Let's not spend any money on mental health care or whatever. That's just not true. You can definitely change something, and you can definitely do a policy that's going to help an outcome, good or bad. Take, for example, myopia. Myopia in modern society is highly heritable. It's one of the most heritable things. I don't remember the exact figure, but it's around 90% genetic. In the variation in the population can be attributed to genetics, not about 90% of it. I was severely myopic, but we have an easy fix to that, that the economist Arthur Goldberger cited back in the 70s, which is glasses, right? Just because there's this inequality in how well we can see far distances doesn't mean we can't fix it, because it's genetic in basis. There's contact lenses, there's laser surgery, there's all sorts of things we can do to fix it. For some reason, there's an intuition that people have that just because something is genetic, it's immutable, but that's just not the case. And then the last thought on this dimension is that how society or people react to something being thought of as more or less influenced by our genetics, our genetic differences, really varies on the phenotype. So in the 90s, there was some early research that turned out not to replicate or to stand up, but that suggested that male homosexuality had a genetic basis on the X chromosome. And as I said, it didn't really stand up that research. But the notion that there was a genetic, that male homosexuality was, at least in part, driven by our genes that we don't control, that was a narrative that was actually pushed by not all, but some gay activists at the time, queer activists. And at the time, I thought that's crazy. Like, we're 50 years out still from the Nazis, and I had thought that the recipe for creating sort of a category that was deeply oppressed and, perhaps attacked with genocidal aims was to create a fundamental biological difference narrative. And so I thought why are certain queer activists arguing for the genetic basis for sexuality? And they, but it turns out they were right and I was wrong, that, in the moral landscape where homosexuality had been seen as a choice, and there was, gay therapy and so forth to try to talk people out of their, more or less innate sexual preferences, was crazy. And that once they took it, the gamble was that once it was seen as something that's biological, like how tall you are, people weren't going to be morally judged about it, and it would be depoliticized. And they were right. It's not a correlation doesn't equal causation, but in the 20 years since, even though actually that research didn't hold up, and there's been more recent research on the genetic architecture of sexual orientation, the norms have shifted incredibly to be much more tolerant for non-heteronormative sexuality. But the moment we shift to something like IQ or educational attainment or income, something that's kind of measures social inequality, that whole equation flips, showing that one person, or God forbid, a group of people have a genetic tendency to have less or more education or income or IQ. The politics on that completely shifts. I think it's really fascinating why that is. Why sexuality or BMI seems to follow a different moral logic with respect to genes and environment than does things that we think of as relevant to social inequality.
When I read this in the Genome Factor in your book, and you mentioned tried to find this gene that proved that homosexuality was in a biological narrative, biological sense, fact, I also started, like, I was keep thinking to myself, this is a justification for hatred. It shouldn't be the other way. But they try to prove it, as you say right now, for empathic reasons, for people to have sympathy. And it's the question that you bring, that why does the conversation shift so drastically, and who is driving the conversation to that sort of thinking, that if someone, for example, has higher IQ than another one, why should it be a relation of inferior and superior things? Because right now we think of IQ as this way of getting the most wealth and most resources in our society. Coming back to what you said, predisposition, that once we think that biology plays a big role in our lives, it tends to make one think that there is no free will, as you mentioned, that everything is determined, therefore we shouldn't do nothing, everything's justified. The big shifting in my thinking, thanks to the Genome Factor, to your book, was that we shouldn't think of this as predisposition, but rather as probability, and how to enhance the best probabilities for the people, for try to enhance the best outcomes for everyone. And this is such a big question, such a huge topic to tackle, because connecting it to the 21st century, where pretty much every academician, every intellectual has argued that we live in the best times of resources and abundance. The question is how to deploy it for everyone's best position.
I guess one of the insights of gene environment interaction research is that it's very hard to do that, to have something that's universally beneficial to everybody. So, for example, take smoking. One thing we've observed is that back in the early 20th century, people who were born in 1920, say, genetics had relatively little influence on who smoked. Not zero influence, but less influence. Smoking was just widespread habit. And then you fast forward to 1964 and the Surgeon General's report, and this sort of public consciousness of the dangers of tobacco start emerging, and you start to see a shift to where genetics matters much more for who smokes than who doesn't. Basically, people who did not have a genetic predisposition to be very addicted to nicotine, learned about the dangers of smoking and stopped smoking, or never took it up, perhaps. People who are hardwired that the moment they taste that first drag of cigarette that someone, peer pressures them to try in high school or something like that, and they get that rush from the binding of the nicotine to their receptor in the brain, it's very hard for them to quit. So we see that today, genetics is a much better predictor of who's smoking or how much they're smoking than it was in people who came of age in 1940. So that's all to say that you do something good, like for public health's sake, you publicize the negative impacts of smoking. You put taxes on cigarettes and so forth. It did a lot of good public health, and obviously we smoke much less overall as a population than we did before. But it didn't affect everybody equally. Some people who are hardwired to really be addicted to nicotine are now paying a lot more of their income out of pocket.
Wow.
Particularly, big deal for low-income folks to get their necessary in quotes, nicotine fix, because a pack of cigarettes in most states has a lot of taxes on it. They're still suffering from higher rates of lung cancer and emphysema and other tobacco-related diseases because of their genotype. I don't know, where that leaves us as a society. We shouldn't not have anti-smoking public policies, I think, because certain people are going to be more inelastic, as we call it, to those policies. But you're going to have a differential response based on genotype for something like that. Environments shift, and genes play a role in inequalities that emerge from those shifts in environment. So you can't think of policy, I don't think, as a one-size-fits-all kind of approach.
That's the perfect segue to ask you this question, because you talk about some great concept in your book, that you say that there's this interplay, this relationship in an evolutionary sense that benefits humanity, which is some people flourish as orchids and some people flourish as dandelions, right? And I would love for you to explain that. That's amazing. And you argue that we should start thinking that genes can help us out to understand how can we start shaping policies that are precision type, personalized policies.
Yeah. So the metaphor of the orchids and dandelions is that the orchids, yes, they're a beautiful flower, but they require a very specific set of environments to exact humidity, exact temperature, exact number of hours of light per day to flourish. Otherwise, they die. They're very sensitive. Mm-hmm. Dandelions, I'm looking at some out of my window. They can basically grow in any kind of soil, in many different environments, cold, warm, etc. And the idea is that well, some people, and sort of the extension of that metaphor is that dandelions, they're not as beautiful as orchids. Like they don't achieve as much greatness in the flower category, but they're hardy survivors, and they're pretty resistant to a variety of forms of environment. Now, the metaphor, it's not a perfect metaphor, but the idea is that some people, rather than just saying, I have a genome that makes me taller or shorter than you, we might think of one population where the average height for men is, 5'10". Almost all the men are, within an inch or two of that median or mean. And population B has the same exact 5'10" average height for men, but the spread is huge. You have men that are 6'10", you have men that are 5 feet, and the distribution is much flatter, the bell curve. And that's a different form of genetic variation or outcome phenotypic variation than we usually study. Usually we're just trying to see who's tall. We're looking for the genes that make someone taller or shorter. So it's a new approach to looking at genetics that I think is more or shows promise for social sciences and people who are interested in gene environment interplay, is to look for genes that regulate how tight that distribution is. Whether you're in population A, wherever people tend to be clustered very tightly around the mean, that they're programmed, so to speak, in quotes, to achieve that phenotype of 5'10", regardless of the environment, whether they're getting a lot of nutrients, a lot of calcium, or a little calcium, versus population B, which says the genetics is programmed to, it turns out that the genetics allows for a wider variety of phenotypes in response to either other genetics in the organisms or to different environments or random fluctuation. Mm-hmm. So when we look for those kind of genetic signatures that don't just predict how tall or short or whatever the outcome is you're going to be, but predict whether you're sensitive, whether you have a high degree of variability or plasticity, I think that's going to help open up the gene environment interaction kind of space for us to better understand how people react differently to different social and natural environments. We want orchids and we want dandelions is the point, as a population. So as a population, imagine flowers, again, in a plant. And if a certain plant needs ideally the maximum amount of sun, mm-hmm. that means in the northern hemisphere, it should be in full bloom on June 20th or 21st for the summer equinox. However, what happens if it's totally clouded over on June 21st? And it's a dark day, and that's the only day that they're flowering. Let's imagine. Then they're going to die, and that strain is going to die out. So that's kind of like the group that's all 5'10" or within a very narrow range. What if that height, for some reason, the environment is not advantageous, even though it's been advantageous for generations up till now? Then it helps to have the people who are 5 feet and the people of 6'10", just to basically throw a bunch of seeds to the wind, so to speak. And maybe in the new environment, being shorter will be better. Maybe being taller will be better. So in the flowering example, having some genotypes that quote unquote flower too early in the typical seasonality, and some that flower too late, is a good sort of insurance mechanism, genetic insurance mechanism against the idea that particular window of time around June 21st will be very dark for some reason. Similarly, at a population level, it's good to from an individual perspective, most years it might be good for you to be an orchid, mm-hmm. and fine-tuned to the environment as it currently exists to be maximally reproductive and live the longest given the current conditions. But it might behoove the population to have some dandelions who basically flourish at a quote unquote, lower level of evolutionary fitness, i.e. they don't reproduce as much and survive as much, but can adapt and survive at that level in different environmental circumstances. Now, there's a huge debate in biology how that works, because the idea that there's evolutionary forces acting at the population level, at the group level, as opposed to just every individual organism fighting for survival, so to speak, or each gene fighting for survival and replication, is very controversial. But there are mathematical models that show that there are different strategies, and they both work, and they're kind of kept in balance without it being some sort of group level dynamic that requires some other kind of assumptions. Anyway, that's again a metaphor for humans, where we should celebrate genetic diversity, because we never know in a new environment what it's going to be, help us survive. We should especially think of that now in a pandemic, where literally, some of us get sick and may die because of our genotype that may have served us well in some other environmental circumstances, but makes us particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And other people have a genotype that they're relatively unaffected, or they only experience minor deleterious effects from COVID-19. If we were all had the genotype where we were likely to have severe illness or die from COVID-19, we would be wiped out. So, it's, I think, intuitive to understand why genetic diversity is valuable to a population.
You talk about evolution, and there's this concept called evolutionary pressures, right? So for certain environments, evolution tells you there are certain genes that appear and function. So one example that you shed a light on in the Genome Factor is people who were lactose tolerant survived much more than those who didn't, because there was lack of water resources, for example.
That's in certain environments. And that's actually a great example of gene-environment interaction, because a lot of white supremacists like to cite lactose tolerance, that lactose persistence, actually, that basically they can digest lactose, not just during childhood, which all or pretty much all humans can do, because we are mammals and we drink our mother's milk, but that lactose, the ability to metabolize lactose, persists into adulthood. They like to suggest that makes, because that's disproportionately present in European populations, that's the ability to digest milk and dairy products means that it has led to Europeans being smarter and stronger and superior to other groups that are lactose intolerant. However, it's really interesting to turn that around. Some groups became, first of all, you didn't need to develop lactose tolerance if you didn't have domesticatable animals that provided milk. So most of sub-Saharan Africa does not have domesticatable large animals that would provide a milk source. Other environments like East Asia had water buffalo and other domesticatable animals, but still don't have lactose persistence. But you don't need lactose persistence if you learn how to make yogurt, because yogurt has the lactose, the enzymes in it that will digest the lactose for you. So in a sense, you could turn that around and say the only reason that Europeans have lactose persistence is because we were too dumb to figure out how to make yogurt. Or cheese, certain cheeses. So the point is that there are many ways that humans can survive and flourish. And of course, you don't even need milk to survive and flourish. I mean, there's many other sources of protein and calcium and so forth. So that's, that shows both the kind of beauty of diversity in the human population and some of the fallacies that pernicious individuals who want to assert for political or whatever reasons, psychological reasons, that they belong to a group that's superior somehow innately to other groups. We're all adapted to our environments over evolutionary timescales.
This brings me to something that you mentioned. There was this study that talked about the Goldilocks area for economic development, which is mind-blowing as well. That says, you mentioned 2 countries specifically, and you mentioned how too much diversity can be translated into, you said that...
This is not me speaking. This is we discussed another article that was published in the American Academic Review by Ashraf and Galor, 2 economists. Yes, and they argue that when there's too much genetic diversity leads to like ethnic conflict and fractionalization and lack of collective institutions, but too little diversity leads to a lack of different points of view and innovation and so forth. And that can explain the pattern of development in the world today. Now, I think we were too, that book was written a few years ago. It was written jointly. I think we let that study off the hook a little too much. I think there's a lot of problems and assumptions in that study. So it's an intriguing idea that there's some ideal Goldilocks level of genetic diversity for economic development, but I think that case is far from proven at this point. There's too many other confounding factors in only one world. We don't have a lot of worlds to have different experimental runs on.
Yeah, trying to connect with what you said earlier in the conversation was that, for example, the ACE studies with twins, there was this factor called the E.
Right.
So that's like the spontaneous in life, and that if I'm listening correctly, that should be taken into account in this study much more deeply, right? So those variables that are much more untangible.
I would recommend people read. It's a very old book at this point, but Guns, Germs, and Steel. That explains all the sort of idiosyncratic geophysical differences across the globe that can help explain why certain countries today are rich and poor. And there's been a lot of work since then on these ancient accidents of history that now yield different levels of development.
Do you think that I wanted to talk about assortative mating, right? And how we use, for example, Tinder or these platforms for online dating. And do you think that it will be possible, that Tinder associates with 23andMe and they tell you like, hey, you know what? This girl for you or this boy or anyone looks like a great prospect for you. However, this and this, or on the other way around, this you swiped to you denied the opportunity to this beautiful person. However, it gives a lot of opportunities for your offspring and for development. Do you think that's possible?
That's possible today. I'm not sure that it's desirable or accurate or anything, but you could imagine a dating website that integrates, you get when you download it, you give it access to your ancestry.com or 23andme.com account. It gets the raw data. It calculates your genetic propensities to certain outcomes, and then people can choose to display that or not display that. But just like if they don't show a picture on their OkCupid or whatever profile, people might be less interested. Mm-hmm. Not showing your genetic card, so to speak, may make potential mates less interested. If you're interested in just a hookup or whatever the term is, then that might not, what someone's genome says may not matter too much to you. But if you're looking for someone to marry and have children with, and you see that they have a genetic propensity to have early Alzheimer's, you may think twice, even if they're really attractive and have other desirable characteristics, or if they have a tendency to have toward mental illness, you might not want to have that passed on to your kids.
Yeah.
So it may come in, it's more information. The problem is that none of those things are, as we talked about extensively, genetically determined. They're genetically influenced to a certain more or less degree.
Mm-hmm.
And then today, at least, we don't have the ability to predict, to actually measure that genetic influence that well. So take, for example, height. Height is thought to be 80 to 90% genetically. The variation in a given population in the Western world is thought to be 80 to 90% due to genetic differences in the population. We can now generate a single score called a polygenic score for height, and it's the best predicting polygenic score for any trait. So we can measure genetics with your saliva or your blood. We calculate a score, and if we do that for 100 people, the proportion of the variation predicted is, I think it's up to about 40%. So we're getting like half of the genetic variation captured. So something for like schizophrenia, if you want to avoid having schizophrenic children, perhaps, so you want to know the schizophrenia polygenic score of your date, we're predicting literally a trivial amount of the variation. I think I don't know what it is currently because the scores keep improving, but it might be like 5%. So do you really want to let this great catch go based on that they have a high score on something that predicts 5% of the variation in schizophrenia? Cost benefit analysis, probably not, but people are not rational, and these things can become self-fulfilling prophecies even. Like people can be shunned for a high score on schizophrenia polygenic score, even though it's relatively trivial in its predictive power. So you can observe that person may not be schizophrenic as an adult. So I'm not sure that there's a lot more information you get than actually knowing someone's height or knowing someone's mental health status or knowing someone's education level that you'll get from these scores. But I could easily see an entrepreneurial startup trying to link the two. The area where I do think that there's like real utility for these kind of predictive scores that are coming out of this genetics research is in sperm and ova banks, where people who need donor sperm, for example, are going on very little information currently in the current system, where they have a picture, they have an essay, they have some basic characteristics, demographic and other characteristics of a donor. They have genetic information like 5 usually major diseases, Mendelian diseases like Huntington's disease or so forth. But that's it. But there you really are not selecting a life partner. You're selecting genetics. You're selecting the DNA to have with your children for anonymous sperm donors. And there I could say, well, you know what? It's fair. We should provide more genetic information. We should provide a range of polygenic scores. That's going to have consequences because you're going to have these kind of like uber donors who score high, and everyone's going to want that sperm. And so they're going to have a whole bunch of half siblings all over the country or the world. I mean, there are definitely social consequences we haven't thought through, but I can see that as a domain where there might be some utility to having these kind of predictive scores disseminated. IVF clinics, when people do assisted reproductive technology, there's already startups that say we're going to give you the polygenic scores for the different embryos and let you choose which you're going to implant. That's sort of a brave new world that was predicted by the movie Gattaca in 1997. Again, I try to be value neutral about all this. I do definitely have my personal ideas of what seems crazy and horrific and what seems reasonable, but in the work, all I do is try to lay out the different possibilities.
I must say that you do have an intention which I share. Once the work you're doing is that we all have a desired outcome, and I share with you. And once you said that it should be subjective well-being, right? It should be trying to flourish the best of each other's opportunities. So that's like the contextualization of the conversation that we're having. These ideas are going to be seen by many people in many different lenses, perspectives, but the whole notion here and everywhere should be that the objective is human flourishing. The objective is trying to maximize everyone's time here the best way possible, right? So time flew by. I'm very honest with you. It was an awesome conversation, and I insist, I have so many things I wanna ask you. And yeah, so closing remarks, is there anything else you want to add?
You can find me on Google if you just, I think my faculty webpage is the first thing that comes up. Easy to find. And not much to add. We covered a lot of ground. I'm sure we could talk for another, over an hour as well, and not repeat anything we said, because there's lots to discuss here, but I feel like we did a pretty good job.
Yes, and I agree, and hopefully our listeners will see that as well, that it was an amazing conversation, and I truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Me too. Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in for this edition of Through Conversations podcast. If you find this episode interesting, don't miss out on new conversations, and subscribe to the podcast at any podcast feed you use, and leave me a review. Also, consider sharing it with someone you think can enjoy this episode. Our new awesome music is by Joe Lyle. More info can be found at joelyledrums.com. Hosted and produced by Alex Levy.